Hello, I'm Sydney and welcome back to my Flock and Squawk. Today we are going to be working on our block of the month. It is block 3, so if you're interested in seeing block 1 and 2 and getting more of a rundown on how I'm doing this, please go check out videos 1 and 2 in the playlist below, as well as over on my blog, flockandsquawk.com. So very briefly, I use a random number generator to select a book off my shelf, and then from there I have it select the page, which in turn gives me the block that I'm going to do. So this month I received this block. It's very straightforward. As you can see, it's part of this quilt. It is out of the Quilters World magazine, the magazine for today's quilter, and this edition is October 2012. So it is quite a few years old now, but it is a square block where it's the square in the center with framing pieces and then triangles to create a diagonal look. So how about we just get right into it? I'll be doing some voiceover, so here we go. Hello and welcome to voiceover. So first, after having picked our block, for me it was time to pick fabric. So for this block I needed 4 fabrics in order to get the effect that they have. I needed a very dark, about 2 medium fabrics I would say, and 1 light fabric. So with that in mind, I went to my tote and I started digging. Now I'm doing all of this out of my stash, and a lot of my stash fabrics are from cotton and steel, so I know for sure that 2 of the fabrics that I end up using are in fact cotton and steel from a few years ago. But the other 2 fabrics did not have any designer information on the salvage edge, so I'm sorry about that. I don't know where they're from. And one of the tips that I used for picking fabric on this one specifically, because if you watched my previous 2 videos, you know that my blocks ended up not having too much contrast between the fabrics, which kind of loses some of the effect. But I took my phone and I set it to black and white and used the camera to look at the fabrics. This helps get an idea of, okay, this fabric's lighter, this one's darker, this one is sort of in the middle, and so you can kind of get a better idea of how the block might look contrast-wise. It takes out the color that could be distracting you because, for example, the green center piece that I end up using, it's hard to tell when looking at it next to the raccoon fabric which one is darker, which one is lighter necessarily, because the color kind of distracts you. So that's one of my tips for this video. And after I picked out my fabric, I also had a second opinion. I had my mom check it out before I fully committed to it. Now, as for pressing my fabric, I pressed all of the fabric flat because it had been in the tote and had gotten wrinkled. So I pressed everything flat. I used spray starch just to make sure that it was a nice solid press, and then I took it over to the cutting table to cut. Cutting for this block is pretty straightforward. It is a couple squares and a couple rectangles, and then the tricky thing about this one is that you have to cut 2 of the fabrics into triangles, as well as cut a 45-degree angle on 2 of the blocks. And with cutting at an angle, you always kind of worry about a little bit about the fabric being warped because of the stretch. And pressing with the starch definitely helps, and then also using pins when you go to sew is another helpful tip if you have that issue of stretching. For me, I didn't have that issue because I had starched my fabric when I pressed it earlier. And finally, we get to sewing. What I like to do when I go to sew a block is usually lay out my pieces for the block as they would appear finished, and that way when I grab two pieces and put them right sides together, I know for certain that it is the correct orientation. Now for some blocks they get too complicated and I just lay out the section that I'm working on first, and then when I finish however many sections for those blocks, I lay it out to get an idea of what the finished block will actually look like. But for this one, it was simple enough that I laid it out as is and then sewed. Like I said, you can use pins for hoping or to help with the stretch that might arise from having cut on a diagonal. For me, I just went for it. I pressed my seams between, and I have a very nice block. And finally, you can see I'm pressing out my seams for the block, and you can get a good idea of how it came together. I hope that you are able to get an idea of how this block comes together, and I hope that you'll join me on making not only this block, but my previous blocks and whatever future blocks we end up with for this quilt along. Thank you so much. And there you have it. We have finished block number 3. If you're interested in seeing block 1 and 2 again, I'll have it linked in the playlist, as well as you can check out over on my blog, flockandsquawk.com, the other 2, and this one as well. I have posts on all 3, as well as more of an explanation on how I'm picking my quilt blocks. Also, just one last tip, as you saw in the cutting especially, I wrote down the cutting instructions for just the one block, so I can reference this instead of seeing all the cutting for everything else involved in the quilt. So that's just another little tidbit for you. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to see more from me, of course, the blog, flockandsquawk.com, as well as over on Instagram at flock_squawk. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.